The Japanese were back. Barely 3 days after Pearl Harbor, they were striking hard at any American forces left in the Pacific. Bombs hammered the ground, each explosion shaking the earth at Cavite Navy Yard. Rear Admiral Rockwell's heart sank as he watched fires tear through the facility, heat radiating even from a distance. They were unprepared. Anti-aircraft guns fired nonstop, but it was useless. The bombers soared 6,000 feet above any shell they could send. Rockwell's eyes locked on the Naval Ammunition Depot. The depot was the yard's lifeblood. It was full of explosive materials. If it caught fire, they were goners. Worse, this was the largest American naval installation west of Hawaii. America's hold on the Pacific would vanish in a single, catastrophic explosion. Crosshairs on Cavite. Cavite Navy Yard, situated at Manila Bay's eastern edge, served as the U.S. Navy's primary repair and refueling base in the Philippines from 1898 to 1948. Seized from Spain following the Battle of Manila Bay, the yard became the Asiatic Fleet's headquarters. The U.S. Navy modernized outdated Spanish facilities, transforming Cavite into the key naval hub during the Philippine-American War. Navy leadership ultimately selected Cavite over Subic Bay in 1908, despite Subic's deeper waters, due to Manila Bay's superior defensive position with fortifications like Corregidor. President Theodore Roosevelt's shift toward Pearl Harbor halted major expansion plans. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 further restricted the fortification of overseas bases until 1936. But after Japan rejected the treaty, limited modernization resumed in Cavite. New tools were installed and the workforce expanded, but defenses remained unchanged. By 1941, the vulnerable 50-acre yard was densely packed with 146 buildings, ammunition stores, fuel tanks, and fabrication shops. A perfect target. Red sun rising. In the middle of the night in Manila Bay, on December 8, 1941, a terse message from Admiral Thomas Hart arrived, quote, "Japan started hostilities. Govern yourselves accordingly." While Pearl Harbor burned 5,100 miles to the east, Cavite Navy Yard in the Philippines, the largest American naval installation west of Hawaii, braced for impact. As morning broke, Rear Admiral Francis Rockwell, the 55-year-old commander of the 16th Naval District, stood vigilant at his headquarters near Cavite Navy Yard. His eyes were fixed on the brightening sky. He muttered to a nearby subordinate, quote, "They ought to be here any minute." The sprawling facility buzzed with urgent activity. Rockwell's PT boats scattered from their moorings. Crews frantically pumped fuel oil into drums for transfer to barges that would be towed into Manila Bay. Intelligence officers fed classified documents into roaring incinerators. The yard, normally teeming with 8,000 Filipino civilian workers, operated with minimal personnel, only those essential for critical vessel repairs. Fortunately, Rockwell and Commander R.J. Dewall had already implemented evacuation procedures for nearby Cavite City and San Roque. Personnel shelters constructed before the war stood ready. Morning fog over Japanese airfields on Formosa temporarily delayed the enemy's plans. When the weather cleared, waves of Japanese aircraft thundered across Luzon. They struck first at Clark Field and surrounding airfields, obliterating General MacArthur's air forces and seizing control of Philippine skies. Bracing for impact. The Cavite facility was a natural target, packed with repair shops, ammunition depots, and fuel storage. It embodied American naval strength in the Philippines. This strategic value made it the superior choice over nearby Sanley Point, which Admiral Hart viewed as especially vulnerable to attack. Even worse, as Rockwell put it, quote, "It was truly an aviator's dream of a perfect target for fragmentation and incendiary bombs. Protection consisted solely of 3 obsolete 4-gun 3-inch 50 caliber AA batteries, plus AA machine guns and the shipborne guns at the waterfront. The water level prevented digging even silt trenches deeper than 2 or 3 feet. With reports of incoming Japanese aircraft, they shifted to defensive preparations, surrounding critical structures with sandbags, while anti-aircraft crews stood at combat readiness. Rockwell had already ordered heightened readiness following an earlier meeting with Admiral Hart, stating pointedly, quote, "Total blackouts were ordered. The AA guns were authorized to open fire on unidentified planes, and every effort made to be ready for the opening of hostilities. Approximately 400 to 500 American sailors operated the installation that serviced the growing Asiatic fleet. These American forces faced overwhelming odds against Japan's air superiority. The Mitsubishi G3M and G4M medium bombers, deployed against Philippine targets, could deliver 1,764-pound bomb loads from altitudes exceeding 10,000 feet, well above the effective range of most anti-aircraft weapons available to defenders. Still, the morning of December 10, 1941, dawned with deceptive tranquility over Manila Bay. Thunder from Formosa. For 2 full days since war erupted across the Pacific, Cavite Navy Yard had remained mysteriously untouched while Japanese bombers pounded airfields across Luzon. At 10 a.m., approximately 134 Japanese aircraft, 52 A6M0 fighters, and over 80 bombers lifted off from Formosa's airfields as morning fog dissipated. Their target, the sprawling naval complex at Cavite. Private Brooks Miller, a 21-year-old California native with 3 years in the Marines, sat with Private Louis Sontag at Battery F on Guadalupe Pier. The 2 Marines watched Filipino workers digging air raid trenches across the yard. After days of false alarms, a dangerous complacency had settled over the Marines and thousands of Navy personnel and civilians working the facility. But the base teemed with activity that morning. USS Mindanao, a small river gunboat, had arrived from China carrying Japanese prisoners. 2 obsolete 4-stack destroyers underwent collision repairs at Central Wharf. Submarines USS Sea Lion and Sea Dragon were tied together, with the minesweeper Bittern positioned at an adjacent pier. The submarine tender Otis, minesweeper Quail, submarine rescue ship Pigeon, patrol yacht Isabel, and destroyer John D. Ford, in for quick refueling, completed the vulnerable collection of vessels. Lieutenant Malcolm Champlin had been working frantically since the war's outbreak to disperse volatile fuel stores under Rear Admiral Francis Rockwell's orders. That morning, tugs nudged barges loaded with over 1,100 drums of 100-octane aviation fuel into Manila Bay, while crews relocated additional barrels to beaches away from buildings. Then, at 12:35 p.m., the air was shattered by the shrill wail of the warning siren, echoing across Cavite. Marines and sailors sprinted to their battle stations. No more false alarms. The first wave. Eyes turned skyward as a formation of 27 Japanese bombers appeared, slicing through the air in a tight V. The bombers were flanked by Swift Zero fighters, cutting across Manila Bay from the west. At first, some Marines cheered, mistaking the aircraft for Army replacements finally arriving. One of them even pointed excitedly at the fluttering objects falling from the planes, thinking they were leaflets. But as the aircraft swept over the yard and curved back for a second pass, reality set in. The aircraft weren't dispersing leaflets. They were lining up their target. As soon as the fighters swept back, the Marines' misguided optimism evaporated. Private Miller, Sontag, and the others realized their fateful mistake. Those weren't leaflets. They were bombs. The first explosions landed harmlessly in Manila Bay, but the next wave struck hard. The ground shook as the air filled with smoke and flame. Cavite's anti-aircraft crews sprang into action, sending streams of tracers into the sky. But it wasn't enough. At Battery F, rangefinder reported grimly that the enemy aircraft were flying above 21,000 feet, well beyond the 15,000-foot ceiling of their guns. The lieutenant barked back, ordering another check. The answer didn't change. Frustrated, the officer cursed and gave the only order left to give: fire anyway. Miller, Sontag, and the other Marines opened fire with their .50 caliber machine guns, the rounds streaking upward, an exercise in futility. Within 15 minutes, the first bomb struck fuel storage areas near the pier. Fireballs erupted, sending thick black smoke skyward. Secondary explosions from igniting gasoline barrels shook the ground. The air filled with acrid smoke as fuel burned. Amid the rising mayhem, Admiral Rockwell gave the order without hesitation. Fighters needed to be in the air immediately. few remaining American fighters were scattered and overwhelmingly outnumbered by the 52 Japanese Zeros circling overhead. As the barrage continued, gunners took a desperate shot at a lone aircraft approaching from Manila. The plane spiraled into the bay, but it wasn't an enemy bomber. It was a U.S. P-40 Warhawk fighter. Mistaken for a Japanese attacker, the pilot was quickly pulled to safety by a rescue party dispatched from the yard. With no other American aircraft visible to counter the bombers, the base was left defenseless as the assault raged on. Chain reaction. By 1 p.m., all 54 Japanese aircraft were engaged in the attack. Direct hits pounded USS Sea Lion, which took 2 bombs that caused her to sink by the stern and claimed 4 crewmen. The minesweeper Bittern absorbed devastating damage from bomb fragments and spreading fires. Ship and yard personnel worked desperately to complete repairs on vessels able to escape. The bombing continued relentlessly for 2 hours. The Japanese methodically targeted the yard's critical infrastructure: power plant, dispensary, torpedo repair shop, supply office, warehouses, signal station, commissary, receiving station, barracks, and officers' quarters. Rockwell wrote, quote, "The entire yard and about 1/3 of the city of Cavite was set ablaze from end to end. But fortunately, no direct hit was made on the Naval Ammunition Depot itself, which still contained much powder and ammunition." For the wooden structures of Cavite Navy Yard, the incendiary effect proved catastrophic. Fires spread rapidly across the overcrowded installation. Sailors and Marines joined civilian firefighters battling the conflagration, while simultaneously helping evacuate personnel, weapons, and ammunition from areas threatened by exploding torpedo warheads. At 2:30 p.m., a Japanese bomber zeroed in on the torpedo repair shop and scored a direct hit. The blast was immediate and violent. Metal fragments, machinery, and flaming debris tore through the air, some hurtling hundreds of yards from the epicenter. Seconds later, torpedo warheads inside the shop began to cook off. A chain of deafening secondary explosions ripped through nearby buildings, setting off fires and triggering chaos across the yard. Admiral Rockwell had taken cover with 2 Filipino Navy Yard workers in a shallow trench, barely more than a ditch scraped into the soil. He emerged unscathed, but one of the workers perished in the blast. The other was badly wounded. Reflecting on their composure under fire, Rockwell later said, quote, "Both of these men were calm and in their assigned places for the air raids." Shaken but resolute, he immediately joined the rescue teams. Courage under fire. Lieutenant Champlin wasn't on base when the attack began, but he wasted no time. He jumped into his car and sped toward the Navy Yard as bombs rained down. Approaching the bridge, he found a flood of vehicles fleeing, many carrying the wounded. Suddenly, 2 trucks collided ahead of him. Champlin leapt into the back of one, helping move the injured into private cars for evacuation to the hospital. Despite the bedlam, he pressed on and eventually made it into the base, where he reconnected with Admiral Rockwell. Unfazed by his own condition, Rockwell had a primary concern. He wrote, quote, "Every effort was made to keep the fires away from the Naval Ammunition Depot and the few buildings still standing, but frequent shifts of wind, lack of equipment, loss of the powerhouse and fire mains made this impossible." The situation stayed critical, but when it ultimately became clear the Naval Ammunition Depot might ignite and blow, orders were issued to evacuate the yard. Personnel were herded to a public school in San Roque, guarded to ensure no one dared return. Rockwell praised the bravery of both his men and the native Filipinos. Quote, "The conduct of all officers and men, not only during the initial bombing, but throughout the very difficult period which followed, was one of the highest order and fully in keeping with the best traditions of the service. The conduct of the Navy Yard employees, most of whom were native Filipinos, was also worthy of special commendation." As flames swept through repair shops and storage facilities, the Navy's ability to maintain its Asiatic fleet disintegrated before Rockwell's eyes. By late afternoon, the bombing finally ceased. The Japanese aircraft, low on fuel and ammunition, turned northward toward their Formosan bases. Thick smoke billowed thousands of feet into the air, visible from Manila, 30 miles away. Only ashes remained. Later that evening, a massive fire reignited in the lumberyard. Undermanned firefighting crews, exhausted from hours battling blazes across the base, couldn't contain this new threat as it rapidly consumed adjacent structures. Surveying the devastation at dusk, Admiral Rockwell made the difficult decision to abandon the yard. At 9 p.m., he ordered the last remaining military personnel evacuated to San Roque. The fires would burn unchecked throughout the night, consuming what remained of America's principal naval base in the Western Pacific. In the harbor, the submarine USS Sea Lion was beyond salvage and was later scuttled. Bittern, severely damaged, would be towed to Fort Hughes in Manila Bay, then to Mariveles Harbor on Bataan, before being scuttled on April 9, 1942. Through extraordinary efforts, some vessels survived. Perry, Pillsbury, Whippoorwill, and Otis escaped southward to later participate in the Battle of the Java Sea. Other ships remained operational to support U.S. forces at Bataan and Corregidor. In the harsh morning light, Rear Admiral Francis W. Rockwell returned to survey what remained of his command. At 6 a.m., he assembled his senior officers amid the wreckage. The devastation was complete. 2/3 of the yard lay in ashes. Twisted metal frameworks jutted skyward where workshops once stood. The power plant, torpedo repair shop, and most administrative buildings had vanished. Fires still burned in several sectors, sending columns of acrid smoke skyward. The Rear Admiral stood before his superior officer, Admiral Thomas C. Hart. The situation was clear. Cavite could no longer serve as a viable naval base. The few surviving facilities at nearby Sanley Point would support limited operations. Without Cavite, ships requiring major repairs would need to withdraw thousands of miles to Australia or even American West Coast ports. Rockwell's voice remained steady, but heavy with the situation's weight, as he ordered everything movable, torpedoes, mines, ammunition, small arms, to be secured for transport to Corregidor and Mariveles. Working parties struggled through the smoldering ruins, salvaging what equipment remained usable. The Naval Ammunition Depot, miraculously spared direct hits, became the highest priority, as teams frantically transferred explosives to barges for transport across Manila Bay. America had lost its key repair and supply hub in the Western Pacific, mere hours after the war had begun. Pacific Pivot. The human toll proved difficult to tally. One report tallied 167 casualties, with 285 wounded. The U.S. Navy's official estimate placed fatalities between 65 and 70. On December 13th, recovery teams dug through the rubble. The bombing had taken the lives of 122 Filipino civilians. Meanwhile, Naval Hospital Canyasao evacuated all patients and staff to Sternberg Army Hospital in Manila, anticipating further Japanese air attacks against remaining U.S. installations. Their fears proved correct. At 10:45 a.m. on December 19th, Japanese aircraft returned to strike Sanley Point. Their primary targets: fuel storage and communications. Bombs pummeled remaining aviation fuel drums. The radio tower collapsed in a tangle of steel and wire as the power plant erupted in flames. By December 24th, Japanese ground forces had landed on Luzon and began their drive toward Manila. Admiral Hart ordered all remaining naval vessels to withdraw southward toward the Dutch East Indies, representing the last organized American naval presence in the region. The remaining torpedo boats conducted nightly raids against Japanese shipping while maintaining evacuation routes for military and civilian personnel fleeing to Bataan and Corregidor. These small, swift craft represented America's only remaining naval offensive capability in Philippine waters. On January 2, 1942, Japanese forces entered Manila. The following day, Imperial Japanese Navy personnel raised their flag over Cavite Naval Yard's ruins, immediately assessing which facilities could be restored for their use. For the Americans confined to Bataan and Corregidor, the loss of Cavite eliminated any realistic hope of naval support or evacuation. General Douglas MacArthur's forces would fight on until May 1942, when Corregidor's surrender marked the end of organized American resistance in the Philippines. 3 years later, American forces under General MacArthur liberated Cavite during their campaign to recapture the Philippines, finding a naval base systematically stripped by retreating Japanese forces. By June 1946, what remained of Cavite Navy Yard consisted of only a small pontoon dry dock, a few lighters, light cranes, and a single patrol boat. On January 15, 1948, the U.S. Navy formally disestablished the facility that had once represented American naval power projection throughout the Western Pacific. The devastating 2-hour bombing on December 10, 1941, had accomplished what diplomatic negotiations never could: the end of America's oldest overseas naval installation, and with it, a chapter in U.S. naval history that stretched back to the Spanish-American War.